Welcome back. We've got some more Pauper Cube content for you. Today we're going to talk about colorless cards. Now, depending on who you ask, there's a lot of different sectors of cards that could be included in this. Today I'm going to exclude signets. Arguably they could be in the multicolor section, arguably colorless. Regardless of which way you want to have that conversation, I'm just going to exclude them for purposes of entertainment because it's not fun to have half of a top 10 list dominated by very similar cards. I'm also going to exclude color fixing lands, like the bounce lands of Ravnica, because again, similar to the signets, half of them would be on the top 10 list. So starting off with the honorable mention, maybe dishonorable mention in this context, Desert, originally from Arabian Nights. You can tap it to add 1 colorless mana, or you can tap it to have Desert deal 1 damage to target attacking creature. Play this ability only during the end of combat step. So essentially Desert will ping those creatures, but the creatures will deal their combat damage first. This card, if you choose to include this in your Pauper Cube, it's going to make aggro a lot less viable. This actually kills a ton of efficient flying creatures and shadow creatures, which maybe that's a good thing. I guess it depends on who you ask. It also destroys a ton of tokens, which most aggressive decks, and well, to be fair, most decks in Pauper Cube will have some form of tokens. You can pretty much be sure that Desert will have targets in your opponent's deck regardless of what kind of deck they're playing. And even if it doesn't, this doesn't really take up a spell slot. It can be your 17th or 18th land. Now, a lot of people may disagree that this should even be on a colorless list, being that it is a land, but it doesn't really go into any of the color. I don't really know where else you would put it in a top 10 list. So this is the only time that I'm going to mention colorless lands, or lands like Ash Barrens. But keep in mind, I do think Desert, Quicksand, Terramorphic Expanse, and its reprints, and Ash Barrens are all cards that should be included in a Pauper Cube concerned with power level. At number 10, I have Adventuring Gear, originally from Zendikar. 1. Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under control, equipped creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, equip 1. If you get this out early, it can run away with the game. It's not exactly the most reliable equipment. It's not the most powerful equipment on the list. Giving a creature +2/+2 at pretty much any point in the game is going to have it trade with most creatures in the Pauper Cube format. I'm not sure exactly how highly I would draft this card. I guess it depends on whatever equipment the cube runs, because you don't want a deck with too much equipment. But I do think the raw potential power level of Adventuring Gear merits it a spot on the top 10. Next on my list is Mind Stone, originally from Weatherlight. It's just a 2-drop mana rock. You can add colorless mana with it, and you pay 1, tap it, sacrifice it to draw a card. So essentially it cycles. I'm actually a big fan of all the colorless mana rocks in the format. The problem is you don't want to play too many of them because a lot of cubes are already running signets, so they kind of compete for the same space. Now, if you're going to include colorless mana rocks, I do think Mind Stone is probably the best of the lot. Prismatic Lens and Guardian Idol are also very good considerations. Like I said, I think all of the 2-drop colorless mana rocks are very good. I just wouldn't want to include too many if you're running signets. With number 8, I have Flayer Husk, originally from Mirrored and Besieged. 1 living weapon. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, equip 2. So this is pretty much on the list for the exact opposite reason of Mind Stone. Mind Stone, we have so much ramp that it's so low because it's just unnecessary. However, Flayer Husk, it's not exactly powerful. It's synergistic. It works with tokens, it works with sacrifice, whatever. But most Pauper Cubes can always use more efficient 1-drops. One problem with the format is we really don't have a lot of good, reliable 1-drops in black and red for aggressive decks. White kind of gets away with that. It does have a decent amount of good cards to select from, but the other colors really don't. So anytime that I can find a decent colorless option for 1 mana, I'm probably going to put it in my cube. My number 7, Ginger Brute from Throne of Eldraine, costs 1, haste 1. Ginger Brute cannot be blocked this turn except by creatures with haste. 2 tap it, sacrifice Ginger Brute, gain 3 life, and it's a 1/1. So it's basically a colorless Raging Goblin, and it's on the list for the exact same reason that Flayer Husk is on the list. I will add pretty much any decent colorless 1-drop creature replacement because we just do not have enough in Pauper Cube. I do think Ginger Brute and Flayer Husk are pretty much on the same level. The fact that this can be suited up with equipment and be made difficult to block for your opponent later in the game kind of puts it over the edge of Flayer Husk. But I guess they're pretty much, similar utility in that regard because Flayer Husk, it's an equipment. So, your mileage may vary, but I do think they're both very good cards and belong in pretty much any Pauper Cube. My number 6, Perilous Mirror, originally from Scars of Mirrodin. It's a 2-drop 1/1. When Perilous Mirror is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to target creature or player. Now this may come off as a little clunky, and I suppose it is, but a lot of early aggression from a lot of decks don't have evasion. If you play this on turn 2, unless they're playing shadow or flying creatures, what are they going to do? They can't remove this because it's just going to kill their creature. This almost always trade 1-for-1 for any aggressive card your opponent has, and a lot of times it's going to trade 2-for-1. And if you play this on turn 2 and get a 2-for-1 against an aggressive deck, well, you're already pretty much in the mid game where most of your other cards can take over. Now this does require a little bit of finesse. It's cumbersome, like we said earlier. It doesn't block shadow creatures, it doesn't block flying, it can be pacified. But even if they play a pacifism on it, you're not losing mana value and you're 1-for-1 trading. And that's basically the worst case scenario. Very rarely will this just chump block and shock your opponent. It almost always will have a target. Breaking into the midpoint here at number 5, Serrated Arrows, originally from Homelands. It's a 4-drop. Serrated Arrows comes into play with 3 arrowhead counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are no arrowhead counters on Serrated Arrows, sacrifice it. Tap, remove an arrowhead counter from Serrated Arrows, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. Now this is slow, I'll give you that, but it has the potential to be a 3-for-1. Now a lot of the times it's not going to be a 3-for-1, it's just going to be a 2-for-1. That's fine. I mean, it's 4 mana 2-for-1 in Pauper. There's a lot worse options than this. And in addition to that, you can play this in blue and green dominated decks that really don't have a lot of good options for removal. There are so many very good and efficient creatures that Serrated Arrows kills that I really think that any cube should have this in their colorless section. It gets even better if you can somehow reset the counters, which there are a few ways in Pauper Cube. I mean, mine has Custody Squire, Repeal, Capsize, that sort of thing. That's just gravy though. 4 mana to kill a couple of creatures, albeit slow, it's fine. Even in colors that have access to removal, like white, I do think this is very respectable. And the fact that colors that usually are inefficient at dealing with small creatures like green, I will take this in my green dominated decks more often than not. Took a bit of a detour with control oriented cards, but now with number 4 we're back to pure aggression. Renegade Freighter from Kaladesh. It's a 3-drop. Whenever Renegade Freighter attacks, it gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn, crew 2 as a 4/3. If you play this on curve, it can literally just run away with the game. Turn 4 5/4 attacker with trample is pretty busted for Pauper Cube stats, and I pretty much want this in any aggressively oriented deck that I draft. Admittedly, it's not great on defense, but that's not what the card's for. It's good at what it excels at, and it excels at killing people. At number 3, I have Porcelain Legionnaire from New Phyrexia. It's 2 and then 1 white Phyrexian mana, so essentially you're just paying this for 2 and 2 life. You could put this in a white deck, but let's be real, if you're playing this, there's a good chance you're playing it for 2 mana, so it essentially goes in any aggressive deck that wants it. And it's got First Strike as a 3/1. First Strike is so powerful that you may even want this in your control decks because it just walls so many ground creatures. This is of course ideal in attacking decks, but a 3/1 First Strike on turn 2 is so powerful that it can just dominate the ground. You can just block with this in your control deck. Now that's not ideal because of the loss of life, but it's a 3/1 for 2 mana with first strike. Those stats are just busted, and that's about as good a stat you're ever going to get for a 2-drop. My number 2 here, Bone Splitter, you've probably heard of it, from Mirrodin, is a 1-drop. Equip creature gets +2, +0, and equip 1. This is a very, very powerful creature enhancement, rivaling Rancor. It essentially is Rancor, but in colorless form. Now granted, they can disenchant this, but if they don't, it's going to make every one of your creatures able to trade with most of your opponent's creatures in this format. Pauper Cube is not really known for big creatures. Almost anything wearing a Bone Splitter is going to trade up. Now this card is very powerful and makes your creatures powerful, so what could be my number 1 pick? My number 1 pick, of course, is Volshock Morningstar from Darksteel. It's a 2-drop, equip creature gets +2/+2, and equip 2. Now this is more mana intensive than Bone Splitter, but you also get significantly more stats. This makes your creatures into actual powerhouses. They don't necessarily always trade like they do with Bone Splitter. +2/+2 in addition to the base stats of most creatures is probably enough to just force a 2-for-1 trade. This card works in aggressive decks, and it works in mid-range decks. It works in hexproof. There's very few decks that I don't want a Volshock Morningstar. I've even used it in heavy controlling decks. Although it doesn't shine there, it's still so many stats for one card. Everything that's good about Bone Splitter is good about Volshock Morningstar, except Volshock Morningstar, while being just a bit more mana intensive, has significantly more power than Bone Splitter does. You really don't see equipment like this at common anymore. Back in the original Mirrodin block, they really didn't know how to balance equipment, so you get stuff like Morningstar and Bone Splitter at common. You will almost certainly never see common equipment statted like this ever again. That does it for my colorless Pauper Cube top 10. A lot of role players, a lot of powerful cards, some busted equipment. It's about all you can ask for out of a colorless section. Hope you enjoyed the top 10, and we'll see you for the next one.